They thought I was finished long before I ever believed it myself. The moment it happened is burned into my memory with an almost cruel clarity. It was a Tuesday morning, grey and ordinary. The kind of day that feels forgettable until it quietly changes your life. I was standing in a narrow hallway that smelled like stale coffee and printer ink, holding a thin folder that contained everything I'd worked for over the past 6 years. Across from me, 3 people sat behind a polished table, avoiding my eyes in the careful way people do when they've already decided your fate. Their words were rehearsed, smooth, and merciless. Restructuring, budget adjustments, not a reflection of performance. I nodded, because that's what you do when dignity is the only thing you have left to protect. By the time I reached the elevator, the building already felt like it belonged to someone else. My access badge stopped working before I reached the lobby. Security smiled apologetically as they escorted me out, carrying a cardboard box that suddenly represented my entire professional identity. Phones buzzed around me, colleagues whispering, pretending not to stare. I caught my reflection in the glass doors as they slid shut behind me, and for a second, I barely recognized the person looking back. That was the version of me they thought was finished, discarded, replaceable, easy to forget. What none of them knew was that this wasn't the end of my story. It was just the part where everything went quiet. For weeks after that day, silence followed me everywhere. Mornings felt heavier without a place to go. The confidence I once carried, like armor, cracked under the weight of unanswered emails and polite rejections. Friends meant well, but offered advice that sounded suspiciously like pity. Maybe take a break. Something better will come. At least you tried. Each word landed like a reminder that, in their eyes, I was already a chapter that had closed. At night, I replayed every decision I'd ever made. Every risk, every compromise, every moment I chose stability over instinct. I wondered when exactly I became someone others felt comfortable dismissing. That question haunted me more than the job loss itself, because deep down, I knew the truth. They didn't let me go because I failed. They let me go because I stopped fitting their narrative. I asked questions I wasn't supposed to ask. I noticed patterns I wasn't supposed to notice. I refused to smile through decisions that felt wrong. Being underestimated does something strange to you. At first, it shrinks you. Then, if you survive long enough, it sharpens you. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped asking for permission. I started working in a way no one could interrupt. My days became focused, quiet, almost invisible. While others assumed I was recovering, I was rebuilding. Not loudly. Not publicly, carefully. Every skill I'd collected over the years, every late night I'd once spent making someone else look good, I redirected inward. I revisited ideas I'd shelved because they were too risky or not practical enough. I studied markets, behaviors, failures. I paid attention to what people ignored when they felt too comfortable. The irony was impossible to miss. The same traits that made me inconvenient inside their system became powerful outside it. There were moments I doubted myself. Moments when the fear crept in, whispering that they were right, that I had peaked, that this quiet stretch wasn't preparation but decline. Those moments usually arrived just before dawn, when the world feels honest and cruel at the same time. But each time, I reminded myself of something simple. People who underestimate you are rarely watching closely. And that gives you room. Room to learn. Room to plan. Room to change direction without being questioned. Months passed. The silence deepened. And then, almost without warning, something shifted. An email landed in my inbox one evening, casual in tone but heavy in implication. A former contact, someone who once brushed past me without a second thought, wanted to talk. Just a conversation, they said. Nothing formal. I agreed, expecting nothing. We met in a quiet place, away from the noise, away from familiarity. I listened more than I spoke. That meeting turned into another, then another. Each conversation opened a door I didn't realize had been unlocked all along. Opportunities don't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes they arrive as whispers, testing whether you're paying attention. The work I began doing quietly started gaining traction. Not because I announced it, but because results have a way of introducing themselves. People started noticing patterns I'd been tracking for years. Systems I'd questioned before suddenly became valuable insights. The same instincts that once made me inconvenient were now being sought out. And still, no one from my old world reached out. No congratulations. No curiosity. They assumed I was still exactly where they'd left me. That assumption would cost them more than they could imagine. By the time word began to spread, it was already too late to control the narrative. Decisions were being made in rooms I now had access to. Rooms they believed I'd never enter. Numbers were moving. Alliances were forming. The foundation of something much larger than me was being laid. Quietly, deliberately. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm in the way you do when things finally make sense. When you realize that being pushed out wasn't rejection, it was redirection. They thought I was finished because they confused visibility with value. They thought silence meant surrender. They thought absence meant failure. They were wrong, and the comeback they never saw coming had already begun. The first time my old name surfaced again, it wasn't attached to failure or sympathy. It appeared in a conversation I wasn't even part of. A mutual contact forwarded me a message by accident, assuming I already knew. "Do you know who's behind this?" Someone had asked. The reply was short. "You won't believe it." I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Not because I needed validation, but because I recognized the tone. Confusion. Surprise. The beginning of disbelief. That was when I understood something important. My absence had made room for my impact. The momentum built quickly after that. Projects I'd nurtured in silence started closing faster than expected. Doors that once felt permanently shut opened without explanation. People who had never returned my calls suddenly found reasons to check in. Their voices carried a different rhythm now, cautious and curious, like they were approaching something they didn't fully understand. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let it stretch. Let them sit with the realization that the version of me they dismissed was never the full picture. What surprised me most wasn't how fast things changed, but how little bitterness I felt. I'd imagined revenge would feel loud, dramatic, satisfying in a cinematic way. It wasn't. It was quiet, controlled, almost boring. The real victory wasn't being seen again. It was no longer needing to be. I had learned how to build without applause, how to move without asking who was watching. That skill changed everything. Then came the call that tied the past and present together in a way I couldn't ignore. A familiar number appeared on my phone one afternoon, one I hadn't seen in over a year. I let it ring. When it stopped, a voicemail followed. The voice on the other end sounded older, tighter, like someone rehearsing humility without fully understanding it. They spoke carefully, choosing words that wouldn't bruise their pride. They mentioned unexpected developments, strategic shifts, and how things had become more complicated than anticipated. What they didn't say mattered more than what they did. They didn't apologize. They didn't admit they were wrong. They asked if I'd be open to talking. I didn't respond right away. Not out of spite, but clarity. Because the version of me they wanted access to no longer existed. When I finally replied, it was brief, professional, measured. I agreed to a meeting, on my terms in a space that felt neutral. No nostalgia, no power games, just reality. Sitting across from them again felt surreal. The same confident posture, the same practiced expressions, but something underneath had shifted. They were no longer in control of the conversation. They knew it. I knew it. They asked questions they once would have dismissed. They listened in ways they never had before. At one point there was a pause, heavy and revealing, when one of them admitted they hadn't expected me to recover so quickly. I didn't correct them. I didn't explain that I hadn't recovered. I had evolved. When the meeting ended, there was no dramatic handshake, no closure speech. Just an understanding. Paths had diverged permanently. And for the first time, that felt like freedom instead of loss. In the weeks that followed, the comeback became visible in ways I couldn't control even if I wanted. 2. Articles. Announcements. That traveled faster than I ever could. People who once overlooked me now referenced my work as if they'd always believed in it. I let them. Their revision of history wasn't my responsibility. My focus stayed forward, where it belonged. What I learned through all of this was simple and brutal. People don't fear failure. They fear being wrong. And nothing unsettles someone more than watching the person they underestimated succeed without needing their approval. That discomfort explained every delayed message, every awkward compliment, every sudden invitation. They thought I was finished because it was convenient, because it allowed them to move on without questioning themselves, because it fit the story they needed to tell. But stories change when the character refuses to disappear. The comeback didn't shock everyone because it was loud or dramatic. It shocked them because it was undeniable, because it happened without permission, because it proved that endings are often just exits from someone else's limited imagination. And if there's one thing I know now, it's this: being written off is not the same as being done. Sometimes it's the quiet moment before everything finally begins.